It was a busy morning at Mercy Hospital. Nurse Emily Parker, a kind and hardworking black woman, was rushing down the hallway with a clipboard in her hand. She had been working at the hospital for 5 years and was known for her patience and dedication. But today, she was feeling extra tired. She had stayed up late the night before helping her little brother with his homework. As she turned the corner, she bumped into Dr. Richard Harris, a well-known surgeon at the hospital. Dr. Harris was tall, with slicked-back hair and a sharp voice. He was respected by many, but he had a reputation for being rude to the nurses, especially Emily. "Watch where you're going, Parker," Dr. Harris snapped, glaring at her. Emily quickly apologized, but Dr. Harris wasn't done. "Honestly, I don't know why they keep you around. You're always so slow and clumsy. Do you even know what you're doing?" Emily felt her face grow hot, but she stayed calm. She had dealt with Dr. Harris's harsh words before. "I'm sorry, Dr. Harris. I'll be more careful," she said softly. Dr. Harris rolled his eyes. "You'd better be. Now come with me. I need you in room 204, and try to keep up this time." Emily followed him to room 204, where a patient was waiting. The patient was a middle-aged man with a kind smile. He was sitting on the hospital bed, flipping through a magazine. Emily noticed that he had a calm presence, like someone who was used to being in charge. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Harris said, walking into the room. "I'm Dr. Harris, and this is Nurse Parker. She'll be assisting me today." Mr. Thompson nodded politely. "Nice to meet you both." Dr. Harris began explaining the procedure to Mr. Thompson, but he kept interrupting himself to criticize Emily. "Nurse Parker, why is the equipment not ready yet? Can't you do anything right?" he said loudly, making sure Mr. Thompson could hear. Emily's hands shook as she set up the equipment. She felt embarrassed and angry, but she didn't say anything. She didn't want to make a scene in front of the patient. Mr. Thompson watched quietly, his eyes narrowing as Dr. Harris continued to humiliate Emily. Finally, he spoke up. "Dr. Harris, I think Nurse Parker is doing a fine job. Maybe you should give her a break." Dr. Harris laughed dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about her, Mr. Thompson. She's used to it. Isn't that right, Parker?" Emily forced a smile but didn't respond. She could feel tears forming in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Just then, the hospital's CEO, Mrs. Linda Carter, walked into the room. She was a tall, elegant woman with a no-nonsense attitude. Everyone in the hospital respected her. "Dr. Harris," Mrs. Carter said, her voice sharp, "I need to speak with you. Now." Dr. Harris looked surprised but followed Mrs. Carter out of the room. Emily stayed behind with Mr. Thompson, who gave her a sympathetic smile. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was telling the truth. "I'm fine, Mr. Thompson. Thank you for asking." Mr. Thompson leaned back on the bed. "You know, Emily, people like Dr. Harris think they're better than everyone else. But they're not. You're doing a great job. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Emily smiled, feeling a little better. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That means a lot." Meanwhile, outside the room, Mrs. Carter was speaking to Dr. Harris in a low, angry voice. "Do you have any idea who that patient is?" she asked. Dr. Harris frowned. "Mr. Thompson? He's just another patient, isn't he?" Mrs. Carter shook her head. "No, Dr. Harris. That's Senator Thompson. He's one of the most powerful people in the state, and he's here to evaluate our hospital for a major funding project." Dr. Harris's face turned pale. "Senator Thompson? But I had no idea." Mrs. Carter crossed her arms. "Well, he certainly got an earful of your behavior, and I can guarantee you he's not impressed." Dr. Harris swallowed hard. "What should I do?" Mrs. Carter sighed. "You'd better start by apologizing to Nurse Parker, and then pray that Senator Thompson doesn't decide to cut our funding because of your actions." Back in the room, Emily was finishing up the preparations for the procedure. She had no idea what was happening outside, but she could feel that something was about to change. Emily was just about to check Mr. Thompson's vitals when the door swung open again. This time, it wasn't Dr. Harris or Mrs. Carter. Instead, A young man in a white coat walked in. He had messy brown hair, glasses, and a friendly smile. Emily recognized him immediately. It was Dr. Alex Martinez, a new resident at the hospital. Unlike Dr. Harris, Dr. Martinez was known for being kind and respectful to everyone, from the janitors to the top surgeons. "Hey, Emily," Dr. Martinez said, giving her a warm smile. "Need any help in here?" Emily felt a wave of relief. "Hi, Alex. I'm just getting everything ready for Mr. Thompson's procedure." Dr. Martinez glanced at Mr. Thompson and nodded politely. "Nice to meet you, sir. I'm Dr. Martinez. I'll be assisting today as well." Mr. Thompson smiled back. "Nice to meet you, Dr. Martinez. You and Nurse Parker make a good team." Just then, Dr. Harris reappeared at the door. His face was red, and he looked like he had just run a marathon. He cleared his throat and stepped into the room, avoiding eye contact with Emily. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Harris began, his voice shaky. I wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. It was unprofessional, and I'm truly sorry." Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "You should be apologizing to Nurse Parker, not me." Dr. Harris hesitated, then turned to Emily. "Nurse Parker, I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you. It was wrong, and I hope you can forgive me." Emily was stunned. She had never heard Dr. Harris apologize to anyone before. She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Dr. Harris. I appreciate it." Dr. Harris nodded awkwardly and quickly left the room, leaving everyone in silence. Dr. Martinez broke the tension with a light chuckle. "Well, that was unexpected." Mr. Thompson leaned back on the bed, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, Emily, people like Dr. Harris often forget that respect goes both ways. But I have a feeling he'll think twice before treating anyone like that again." Emily smiled, feeling a sense of justice. "I hope so, Mr. Thompson." As the procedure began, Emily and Dr. Martinez worked together seamlessly. They made sure Mr. Thompson was comfortable and explained every step to him. Mr. Thompson seemed impressed by their teamwork and professionalism. Meanwhile, outside the room, Mrs. Carter was pacing the hallway, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I understand," she said to the person on the other end. "I'll make sure it's handled." "Thank you." She hung up and took a deep breath. Just then, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a security uniform approached her. His name was Officer Jake Reynolds, and he was the head of hospital security. He had a no-nonsense attitude and a reputation for being fair but firm. "Mrs. Carter," Officer Reynolds said, his voice deep and steady. "I heard about what happened with Dr. Harris. Do you need me to keep an eye on him?" Mrs. Carter nodded. "Yes, Jake. I don't want any more incidents. And while you're at it, keep an eye on Senator Thompson too. We need to make sure his visit goes smoothly." Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Senator Thompson? I didn't know he was here." Mrs. Carter sighed. "Neither did Dr. Harris, and that's the problem. Just make sure nothing else goes wrong. Okay?" Officer Reynolds nodded. "You got it, ma'am." Back in room 204, the procedure was going well. Mr. Thompson was in good spirits, cracking jokes and asking questions. Emily and Dr. Martinez laughed along with him, making the atmosphere light and comfortable. But just as they were finishing up, the door opened again. This time, it was a woman in a sleek business suit. She had sharp features and an air of authority. Emily recognized her immediately. It was Ms. Vanessa Cole, the hospital's head of public relations. "Mr. Thompson," Ms. Cole said, stepping into the room with a bright smile. "I just wanted to check on you and see how everything is going." Mr. Thompson smiled back. "Everything's great, thanks to Nurse Parker and Dr. Martinez here." Ms. Cole glanced at Emily and Dr. Martinez, her smile widening. "That's wonderful to hear. You two are doing an excellent job." Emily felt a surge of pride. "Thank you, Ms. Cole." Ms. Cole turned back to Mr. Thompson. "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to let me know. We want to make sure your visit is as comfortable as possible." Mr. Thompson nodded. "I appreciate that, Ms. Cole. But honestly, I'm more interested in how the staff is treated here. I've seen some interesting dynamics today." Miss Cole's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. Of course, Mr. Thompson. We take staff welfare very seriously. I'll make sure to address any concerns you have. As Ms. Cole left the room, Emily exchanged a glance with Dr. Martinez. They both knew that something big was happening behind the scenes, but neither of them could quite figure out what it was. Little did they know, Mr. Thompson had a plan of his own. He had seen enough to know that changes needed to be made at Mercy Hospital, and he was determined to make sure those changes happened, starting with Dr. Harris. But for now, Emily and Dr. Martinez focused on finishing the procedure. They had no idea that their lives, and the hospital, were about to change in ways they never expected. As Emily and Dr. Martinez finished up the procedure, Mr. Thompson sat up on the bed, stretching his arms. "You two make an excellent team," he said with a smile. "I've been to a lot of hospitals, and I can tell when people genuinely care about their work. You both do." Emily felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That means a lot." Dr. Martinez grinned. "We try our best. Right, Emily?" Before Emily could respond, the door opened again. This time, it was a young woman in scrubs, her dark hair pulled into a ponytail. She looked a little out of breath, like she had been running. Emily recognized her as Sarah Jenkins, one of the newer nurses at the hospital. "Emily," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "I need your help in room 312. It's an emergency." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" Sarah shook her head. "It's a little boy. He came in with a high fever, and now he's having trouble breathing. Dr. Harris is there, but well, you know how he is." Emily glanced at Dr. Martinez, who nodded immediately. "Go ahead, Emily. I'll finish up here with Mr. Thompson." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She hurried out of the room with Sarah, her mind racing. As they ran down the hallway, Sarah filled her in. "The boy's name is Timmy. He's only 6 years old. His mom is really scared, and Dr. Harris isn't exactly helping." When they reached room 312, Emily could hear Dr. Harris's sharp voice from outside. "Why didn't you bring him in sooner? This could have been prevented." Emily pushed the door open and saw a young woman, clearly Timmy's mother, sitting by the bed with tears in her eyes. Timmy was lying on the bed, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Dr. Harris was standing over him, looking frustrated. "Dr. Harris," Emily said firmly, stepping into the room. "What's the situation?" Dr. Harris turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Nurse Parker, the boy has a severe respiratory infection. We need to act fast." Emily nodded and immediately began checking Timmy's vitals. She noticed how scared his mother looked and gave her a reassuring smile. "We're going to take good care of him, ma'am. I promise." Timmy's mother sniffled and nodded. "Thank you." As Emily worked, she noticed that Dr. Harris was unusually quiet. He followed her lead, handing her the tools she needed without a word. It was a strange change from his usual behavior, but Emily didn't have time to think about it. She focused on Timmy, doing everything she could to stabilize him. Meanwhile, back in room 204, Dr. Martinez was finishing up with Mr. Thompson. "You're all set, sir," he said, helping Mr. Thompson sit up. "Just take it easy for the next few days, and you'll be back to normal in no time." Mr. Thompson smiled. "Thanks, Dr. Martinez. You've been great." As Dr. Martinez gathered his things, Mr. Thompson's expression turned serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Dr. Martinez said, sitting down in a chair. "Is Dr. Harris always like that?" Mr. Thompson asked. "The way he treated Nurse Parker earlier. That's not normal, is it?" Dr. Martinez sighed. "Honestly, Mr. Thompson, Dr. Harris has a reputation for being difficult, but today was worse than usual. I think he's under a lot of pressure, but that's no excuse for how he acted." Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And what about Nurse Parker? She seems like an amazing nurse." Dr. Martinez smiled. "Emily is one of the best. She's kind, hardworking, and always puts her patients first. Everyone here respects her, except maybe Dr. Harris." Mr. Thompson leaned back, a determined look on his face. Well, maybe it's time someone did something about that. Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Before Mr. Thompson could answer, the door opened, and Mrs. Carter walked in. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice polite but tense. I just wanted to check on you and see if there's anything else you need. Mr. Thompson smiled. I'm fine, thank you. But I do have a few questions about how this hospital is run. Mrs. Carter's smile faltered slightly. Of course. What would you like to know? Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his eyes sharp. I'd like to know why someone as talented as Nurse Parker is being treated so poorly by one of your top doctors. And I'd like to know what you're going to do about it. Mrs. Carter opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the sound of running footsteps echoed down the hallway. A moment later, Sarah appeared at the door, her face pale. Mrs. Carter, Sarah said, her voice shaking. You need to come to room 312. Now. Mrs. Carter's eyes widened. What's going on? Sarah took a deep breath. It's Dr. Harris. He's gone too far this time. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Thompson, and Dr. Martinez exchanged worried glances before rushing out of the room. As they hurried down the hallway, Emily's voice echoed from room 312, loud and clear. Dr. Harris, you need to stop. You're going to hurt him. The group reached the room just in time to see Emily standing between Dr. Harris and Timmy, her arms outstretched. Dr. Harris looked furious, his face red and his hands clenched into fists. Step aside, Nurse Parker, Dr. Harris shouted. I know what I'm doing. Emily stood her ground, her voice steady. No, Dr. Harris, you're not thinking clearly. Step back. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Mr. Thompson stepped into the room, his presence commanding everyone's attention. That's enough, he said, his voice calm but firm. Dr. Harris, you need to leave this room. Now. Dr. Harris turned to Mr. Thompson, his eyes wide with shock. But, now, Mr. Thompson repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Dr. Harris hesitated, then stormed out of the room, pushing past Mrs. Carter and Dr. Martinez. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Timmy's labored breathing. Emily turned back to Timmy, her hands shaking as she continued to work. It's okay, sweetie, she whispered. You're going to be okay. Mr. Thompson watched her for a moment, then turned to Mrs. Carter. We need to talk. Now. As Mrs. Carter and Mr. Thompson left the room, Dr. Martinez stayed behind to help Emily. The tension in the air was thick, but Emily didn't have time to think about it. She had a little boy to save, and somewhere down the hallway, Mr. Thompson was already making plans to ensure that what happened today would never happen again. As Emily and Dr. Martinez worked tirelessly to stabilize Timmy, the tension in room 312 began to ease. Timmy's breathing slowly improved, and his color started to return. His mother, who had been clutching the edge of the bed in fear, finally let out a sigh of relief. Thank you, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Thank you so much. Emily gave her a reassuring smile. He's going to be okay. We'll keep a close eye on him, but he's out of the woods for now. Dr. Martinez nodded in agreement. We'll make sure he gets the best care possible. Meanwhile, down the hallway, Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Carter were having a heated discussion in her office. Mr. Thompson sat across from her, his expression stern. Mrs. Carter, he began, what I witnessed today is unacceptable. Dr. Harris's behavior is not only unprofessional but dangerous. And the way he treated Nurse Parker, that's not something I can ignore. Mrs. Carter sighed, running a hand through her hair. I understand your concerns, Mr. Thompson, but Dr. Harris is one of our top surgeons. He's under a lot of pressure, and pressure is no excuse, Mr. Thompson interrupted. This hospital is supposed to be a place of healing, not a place where people are mistreated. If you don't take action, I will. Mrs. Carter's eyes widened. What do you mean? Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his gaze steady. I mean that I have the power to make sure this hospital gets the funding it needs or doesn't. And if changes aren't made, starting with Dr. Harris, I'll have no choice but to take my concerns to the state board. Mrs. Carter paled. Mr. Thompson, please. Let's not be hasty. I'll speak to Dr. Harris. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Mr. Thompson shook his head. Talking isn't enough. Dr. Harris needs to be held accountable. And Nurse Parker, she deserves recognition for the incredible work she does. If you won't do something about this, I will. Before Mrs. Carter could respond, there was a knock on the door. Officer Jake Reynolds poked his head in. Mrs. Carter, we have a situation. Mrs. Carter frowned. What now? Officer Reynolds stepped inside, his expression grim. Dr. Harris just left the building. He looked upset, and he took a bunch of files with him. Mrs. Carter's eyes widened. What kind of files? Officer Reynolds hesitated. Patient records. Confidential ones. Mr. Thompson stood up, his face darkening. This is serious. If Dr. Harris is taking patient records, he could be planning something. We need to stop him. Mrs. Carter nodded, her mind racing. Jake, alert the authorities. We need to find him before he does something reckless. Officer Reynolds nodded and hurried out of the room. Mrs. Carter turned back to Mr. Thompson. I'll handle this. I promise. Mr. Thompson crossed his arms. You'd better. Because if Dr. Harris isn't dealt with, this hospital will have much bigger problems than funding. Back in room 312, Emily was finally able to take a breath. Timmy was stable, and his mother was sitting by his side, holding his hand. Dr. Martinez was filling out some paperwork, but he kept glancing at Emily. You okay? He asked quietly. Emily nodded, though she felt exhausted. I'm fine. Just tired. Dr. Martinez gave her a sympathetic smile. You did great today, Emily. You saved that boy's life. Emily smiled back. We both did. Just then, Sarah appeared at the door again. Emily, Dr. Martinez, you need to come to the lobby. There's something you need to see. Emily and Dr. Martinez exchanged curious glances before following Sarah down the hallway. When they reached the lobby, they saw a crowd of hospital staff gathered around the TV. On the screen was a live news broadcast. Breaking news, the reporter said. Dr. Richard Harris, a prominent surgeon at Mercy Hospital, has been accused of stealing confidential patient records. Authorities are currently searching for him, but his whereabouts are unknown. Emily's heart sank. Dr. Harris? Why would he do something like that? Dr. Martinez shook his head. I don't know, but this is bad. Really bad. As the news continued to report on the situation, Emily noticed Mr. Thompson standing nearby, watching the screen with a serious expression. She walked over to him, her mind racing with questions. Mr. Thompson, she said quietly, what's going to happen now? Mr. Thompson turned to her, his expression softening. Don't worry, Emily. This hospital is going to change for the better, starting with making sure people like you are treated with the respect you deserve. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That means a lot. Mr. Thompson smiled. You're welcome. But this isn't over yet. There's still a lot of work to do. As Emily looked around the lobby, she realized that he was right. The hospital was in chaos, and Dr. Harris's actions had only made things worse. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were going to change. But as the search for Dr. Harris continued, no one could have predicted what would happen next. The hospital lobby buzzed with tension as staff members whispered among themselves, their eyes glued to the news broadcast. Emily stood beside Mr. Thompson, her mind racing. She couldn't believe Dr. Harris would do something so reckless. Stealing patient records? What was he thinking? Dr. Martinez stepped closer to Emily, his voice low. This is bad. If those records get out, it could ruin people's lives. We have to do something. Emily nodded, but before she could respond, Mrs. Carter's voice cut through the noise. Everyone, listen up, she called, standing on a chair to address the crowd. We need to stay calm and focused. Officer Reynolds is working with the authorities to find Dr. Harris. In the meantime, we need to make sure our patients are safe and cared for. Let's not let this distract us from our jobs. The staff murmured in agreement, slowly dispersing to return to their duties. Emily, however, stayed behind with Dr. Martinez and Mr. Thompson. She had a sinking feeling that there was more to this situation than anyone realized. "Mr. Thompson," Emily said, turning to him, "do you think Dr. Harris is working alone? Or could someone else be involved?" Mr. Thompson frowned. "It's hard to say, but if he's stealing patient records, he might be trying to cover something up or expose something. Either way, we need to find him before it's too late." Dr. Martinez crossed his arms. "What if he's not just running? What if he's trying to send a message? Or worse, what if he's in danger?" Emily's eyes widened. "You think someone might be after him?" Before Dr. Martinez could answer, Officer Reynolds hurried over, his radio crackling. "We've got a lead," he said, his voice urgent. "Dr. Harris's car was spotted near the old warehouse district. The police are on their way, but we need to move fast." Mr. Thompson straightened. "I'm coming with you." Officer Reynolds hesitated. "Sir, it might not be safe." "I'm not asking," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "This is my hospital too, and I'm not sitting back while this mess gets worse." Emily stepped forward. "I'm coming too." Dr. Martinez nodded. "Same here. If Dr. Harris is in trouble, he might need medical help." Officer Reynolds sighed but didn't argue. "Fine, but stay close and do exactly as I say. This could get dangerous." The group hurried out of the hospital and into Officer Reynolds's patrol car. As they sped toward the warehouse district, Emily's heart pounded. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger than they realized. When they arrived at the warehouse, the area was eerily quiet. The police had set up a perimeter, but there was no sign of Dr. Harris. Officer Reynolds parked the car and turned to the group. "Stay behind me," he said, drawing his flashlight, "and keep your eyes open." They moved cautiously through the dimly lit streets, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. Emily's nerves were on edge, but she forced herself to stay focused. Suddenly, Dr. Martinez grabbed her arm and pointed. "Over there," he whispered. "I saw movement." Officer Reynolds nodded and led the way toward the shadowy figure. As they got closer, they realized it was Dr. Harris. He was crouched behind a dumpster, clutching a briefcase to his chest. His clothes were disheveled, and he looked terrified. "Dr. Harris," Emily called out, her voice trembling. "It's us. We're here to help." Dr. Harris's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay back," he shouted. "You don't understand. They're after me." "Who's after you?" Mr. Thompson asked, stepping forward. "What's going on, Harris?" Dr. Harris shook his head frantically. "I can't tell you. If I do, they'll—" Before he could finish, a loud bang echoed through the alley. A bullet ricocheted off the dumpster, sending sparks flying. Officer Reynolds immediately pushed Emily and Dr. Martinez to the ground, shielding them with his body. "Get down," he shouted. Mr. Thompson ducked behind a nearby wall, his face pale. "Harris, get over here," he yelled. Dr. Harris scrambled toward them, still clutching the briefcase. "I told you," he gasped. "They're here." "Who's here?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking. "What did you do, Dr. Harris?" Dr. Harris hesitated, his face filled with guilt. I made a deal with the wrong people. I thought I could fix things, but now they're after me. And the records." Officer Reynolds cursed under his breath. "We need to get out of here. Now." But before they could move, a group of shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, blocking their path. They were dressed in black, their faces hidden, and they were armed. "Hand over the briefcase," one of them growled, stepping forward. "And no one gets hurt." Emily's heart raced as she realized the gravity of the situation. Dr. Harris had gotten himself and all of them into something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. And as the armed figures closed in, Emily knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over yet. Not even close. The alley was tense, the air thick with fear. The armed figures surrounded Emily, Dr. Martinez, Mr. Thompson, Officer Reynolds, and Dr. Harris, their weapons trained on the group. Emily's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But before anyone could move, Officer Reynolds stepped forward, his hands raised. "Let's all stay calm," he said, his voice steady. No one needs to get hurt here. We can talk this out. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, sneered. We don't want to talk. We want the briefcase. Hand it over and we'll let you go. Dr. Harris clutched the briefcase tighter, his face pale. You don't understand. If they get these records, they'll ruin people's lives. Emily's eyes widened. What's in the briefcase, Dr. Harris? What did you do? Dr. Harris hesitated, then sighed in defeat. I made a deal with a pharmaceutical company. They wanted me to falsify patient records to cover up the side effects of one of their drugs. I thought I could control it, but they turned on me. Now they want the records back to destroy the evidence. Mr. Thompson's face darkened. You risked people's lives for money? Dr. Harris hung his head. I didn't think it would go this far. I just wanted to save the hospital's funding. But I was wrong. I'm so sorry. The scarred man stepped closer, his gun aimed at Dr. Harris. Enough talking. Give us the briefcase, or we'll take it from you. Officer Reynolds glanced at Emily and Dr. Martinez, then at Mr. Thompson. He gave a subtle nod, and in one swift motion, he tackled the scarred man to the ground. Run! He shouted. Emily didn't hesitate. She grabbed Dr. Harris's arm and pulled him toward the alley's exit, with Dr. Martinez and Mr. Thompson close behind. The sound of scuffling and shouts echoed behind them as Officer Reynolds fought to hold off the attackers. As they reached the street, police sirens blared in the distance. Backup had arrived. The armed figures, realizing they were outnumbered, scattered into the shadows. Officer Reynolds emerged from the alley, slightly bruised but otherwise unharmed. Are you all okay? He asked, breathing heavily. Emily nodded, her heart still pounding. We're fine. Thanks to you. Dr. Harris sank to his knees, the briefcase still in his hands. I don't know how to make this right, he said, his voice breaking. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his expression stern but not unkind. You start by telling the truth. All of it. To the police, to the hospital, and to the people you hurt. It's the only way to begin fixing what you've done. Dr. Harris nodded, tears in his eyes. You're right. I'll do whatever it takes. As the police arrived and took Dr. Harris into custody, Emily felt a mix of emotions. Relief, anger, and sadness. She turned to Mr. Thompson. What happens now? Mr. Thompson placed a hand on her shoulder. Now we rebuild. This hospital has good people like you and Dr. Martinez. With the truth out in the open, we can make sure something like this never happens again. Emily smiled faintly. I hope so. Dr. Martinez joined them, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced with seriousness. This was a wake-up call for all of us. But if we work together, we can make this hospital what it's supposed to be. A place of healing and hope. Officer Reynolds nodded. And I'll make sure security is tightened. No more secrets, no more threats. As the group stood together, watching the police lights flash in the distance, Emily felt a sense of closure. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the future. This story teaches us that honesty, integrity, and respect are the foundations of any community, especially in places meant to care for others, like hospitals. Dr. Harris's actions, driven by greed and fear, caused harm to many, but it was the courage and teamwork of Emily, Dr. Martinez, Mr. Thompson, and Officer Reynolds that brought the truth to light. The lesson is clear. No matter how difficult the situation, doing the right thing, treating others with kindness, standing up for what's just, and working together, can lead to positive change. Everyone deserves respect, and no one is above accountability.